握，前进，冒着敌人的炮火，前进，前进，前进，前。
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all so much for joining. That was Paul Robeson opening us up, singing the Chinese national anthem in a true expression of internationalist culture. My name is Leanne Fullahan, and I am the Education Director of the People's Forum and the co-editor of 1804 Books. The People's Forum is a political education and cultural center based in New York City, and we are committed through all of our programs, courses, events, and convenings to contribute to the building of working class internationalist organizations and unity. Out of the People's Forum, we have also started the project of 1804 Books, where you can find socialist literature, Marxist theory, and revolutionary history. And we have also, most importantly, the amazing book, China's Great Road, Lessons for Marxist Theory and Socialist Practices, written by John Ross. You can get it at 1804 Books, and I am thrilled for today's book launch event and very honored to have with us John Ross and an incredible group of speakers that I am very eager to hear from. And before we begin, I want to give a huge thank you and appreciation to the incredible team of women who behind the scenes worked tirelessly to put this book together. Sheila Zhao, Tings Chak, Mia Tala, and Tina Cruz. Thank you all for your work to get this book into the hands of readers around the world in this critical and urgent moment. And I also want to say a big thank you to Gary Bono and international publishers for collaborating with us on this project. And of course, a thank you to the TPF team, Mia, Manolo de los Santos, David, and everyone who put this event together. China's Great Road is an essential read for all of us today in this moment of intensified struggle for the right to organize society in a way that prioritizes life over capitalist profit. This is also a moment of intense escalation of the new Cold War, the US-led hybrid war on China. And for anyone who believes that humanity deserves a world that is organized in a way to preserve human life, we must read this book. We at the People's Forum and at 1804 Books, we approach this reading from the strategic necessity of learning from the diverse experiences of socialist countries over time. The Soviet Union, Cuba, Vietnam, and China leave us with a wealth of knowledge in building societies that break with the global hegemony of capitalism. And China is of particular interest to us, not only because of the past century of revolutionary struggle led by the Chinese Communist Party, but also because in the last few years, we have witnessed a major achievement of poverty alleviation, effectively ending all extreme poverty in the most populated nation in the world. This is a huge and unprecedented achievement, and we all must learn from this example. So luckily, in this collection of 10 articles written over the past decade, John Ross provides for us a clear analysis of China's economic and foreign relation policies over the past decade. He helps us to understand China's socialist project, its history and growth, and what lessons we can take for future socialist projects across the world. He also cuts directly through the Western capitalist propaganda that serves to misinform and misdirect the working people and revolutionary organizations that are struggling for a better future. With us today to address these topics and more are Wang Wen, Professor and Executive Dean of Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies and the Vice President of the Silk Road School at Renmin University of China, Radhika Desai, Professor at the Department of Political Studies, University of Manitoba, Winnipeg, Canada, and the Director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group, Vijay Prashad, Executive Director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and the Chief Editor of Leftward Books, Brian Becker, Director of the Answer Coalition, founder of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and host of the Socialist Program with Brian Becker, and of course, John Ross, author of the book and Senior Fellow at Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China. Thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to pass it first to a video message from Wang Wen before we get to hearing from our live panelists.
Hello, my name is Wang Wen. Firstly, congratulations to John Ross to his new book, And again, to Mr. John Laws for his work for Chongyang Institute, Renmin University of China for many years. Actually, as an executive dean, I'm very proud to have colleagues like John Laws. Mr. John Laws was first former Western high officials to work full-time in Chinese think tanks. In past 8 years, he wrote many books, now in my hand. He has not only made important contributions to Chongyang Institute, but also made important contributions to China's development and China's exchange with the world. Now, John is a well-known scholar in China with more than 2 million fans in the new media, including many Chinese policy makers and a lot of fans in central government and the local government in China. And his articles often have millions of readers and audience. So in this book, China's Great Role, he recounts Chinese stories from unique perspectives of Western and with a professional understanding of China, many of which I have read. This book, I think it's a very distinguished and a very wonderful book. So I agree with John that China's law has learned from the experience and lessons of the West, and also fully demonstrates China's unique wisdom and strength. So China needs more scholars like John Laws to export the road and the future again. So I have to say congratulations again to Mr. John Laws. John, thank you, and I admire you.
Fantastic. So with that, I would like to welcome John Ross. Welcome, John.
Okay, firstly, I've got to thank everyone involved in the production of the book. That's first in China, Chongyang Institute, where I've been the senior fellow for 8 years, and you've just heard from its dean. Outside China for Tricontinental's editor on the books, and 1804 Books, an international publicist for publishing, and the People's Forum for all the work that they've done on this. I want to start on the book by quoting somebody who's a much bigger authority than me on the subject, which is Fidel Castro. The way that Fidel Castro characterized the situation was the following: China has objectively become the most promising hope and the best example for all third world countries. Now, you might also be interested to know what President Xi Jinping said about Fidel Castro. And this is on Fidel Castro's death. It is still the case that the only foreign embassy in China which President Xi Jinping has visited on the death of a foreign leader is the Cuban embassy in China when Fidel Castro died. And this is the statement which part of the statement it concludes: his glorious image and great achievements will go down in history. The great comrade Fidel Castro will be remembered forever. We should understand that what we're taking this tonight is a very small part, although I hope a creditable part, of an enormous discussion which is taking place on China throughout the whole world, and which is reshaping the political discussion throughout the world and the left throughout the whole world. I just want to give some indications of this. When last July the No Cold War campaign was launched, of which I'm heavily involved, it was reported in the Chinese media in Global Times. On the hits on the Chinese media, there were, on the report of the meeting, there were over 100 million hits. I don't believe any participant in the meeting has ever spoken to something which was then read by 100 million people. And this is the discussion in China. I did recently lectures for Tricontinental on the question of China. People from more than 50 countries participated in these. This wasn't doubtless due to the brilliance of the lecture. I hope I did a good job, but it was really due to the importance of the subject. Or just a couple of weeks ago, former President Dilma Rousseff spoke in Brazil with Celso Amorim on the former foreign minister of Brazil, and João Pedro Stadillo is the leader of the biggest mass movement in Latin America, the MST, on the question of opposition to the Cold War and no question of China. Dilma Rousseff made a very good joke because Bolsonaro made a statement which was stupid even by Bolsonaro standards, saying that if you had a Chinese vaccine, you may turn into an alligator. And she said, yeah, that's what we've all got to do. We've all got to turn into communist alligators. And she said, it's very good alligator for politics. You need a thick skin, and an alligator's got a thick skin. So this discussion is taking place throughout the entire world. Why is it taking place? The most fundamental reason is because China shows that socialism works. It's not a dream about the future. It's about the best solution to problems now. You could see this, for example, the way that China's dealt with COVID in 2020. Less than 5,000 people have died in China, in a country which has got more than 4 times the population of the United States. More than 500,000 people have died in the United States from COVID. In a country the size of China, this would mean that 2 million people died if the result has been as bad as the result in the United States. This means that there are literally millions of people alive in China who are alive because of the way that China responded to COVID. Okay. Fundamentally, however, I want to look at the question of why did Fidel Castro say this? And I would only add that it's China as an example, not only for the third world, although it is decisive above all for the 84% of the population of the world that lives in developing countries. But it's due to the sheer scale of what has been achieved. And there are really 3 aims in the book. The first part of the book is to try to get over, particularly to the Western left, because it's written in English and Western readership, the sheer scale of what has taken place in China. And you have to understand this. In 1949, China was almost the poorest country in the world. Angus Maddison, who's the world's top expert on long-term economic statistics, concluded that in 1949, there were only 10 countries in the world that were poorer than China. China, either in 2022 or 2023, will enter the ranks of high-income economies. That's important not merely for income, but it means a huge increase in life expectancy. Life expectancy in China has increased by 30 years. It means educational needs, health service, culture, etc. That's in a single lifetime, 72 years. China has gone from being almost the poorest country in the world to the brink of a high-income economy. And this will transform the world. At the present time, only 16% of the world's population lives in high-income economies. But China by itself is 18% of the world's population. That will more than double. More than that, although what is China's has unique features, that economic model of China and its policies can be followed in other countries. Vietnam has had spectacular economic development as a result of policies very similar to China's. Laos has had spectacular economic development. The country in Latin America, which came closest to what China was doing with state-led economic development, is Bolivia, which is also the most successful economy in Latin America. So in other words, it's not merely a unique characteristic of China. It's not as the West tries to pretend due to some specific features of China. This is an economic system that works. Again, just to give you some examples of this, China has taken 853 million people out of poverty in the world by World Bank standards. That is 3 out of every 4 people in the world taken out of poverty. It wasn't capitalism that cracked the problem of taking people out of poverty. It was socialism. It was in China. The income of households in China in the last 42 years has increased by 1,800%. That is 18 times. That's an unbelievable increase in living standards. The next country in the world after that is 900%. China has had 9.2% average economic growth for the last 42 years. That is the most rapid development of an economy in the entire history of humanity. But also the scale of improvement has to be understood. The first country in the world ever to experience rapid economic growth and the improvement of conditions that went with it was my country, Britain. It was 3% of the world's population, 2% of the world's population. When the US began to grow rapidly after the Civil War, it was 3% of the world's population. When the Soviet Union began to industrialize rapidly in 1929, it was 8% of the world's population. But China in 1978 was 22% of the world's population. China has therefore produced the greatest improvement in the conditions of life of the greatest proportion of humanity in the whole of human history. And that is not rhetoric. That is just a simple statement of fact. And after all, that's what socialism is about. Socialism is to improve the lives of human beings. It's also crucial because other countries can learn from it. I know, for example, as had the great privilege to be invited to Venezuela several times when Hugo Chavez was president, and I have some interaction with debates in Brazil, that an enormous discussion is taking place in the Latin American left about China. And this is exactly right, because China shows that socialism works. If the people of Latin America or the developing world could achieve what China's achieved, that is for the 84% of the world's population that lives in developing countries, many of the problems of the world would be solved. The second part of the book, having explained the facts about this, and those who want to get the facts up, please just read the book, is what achieved this? Was this in contradiction to Marxism, or was it in line with Marxism? And the book explains, I don't have time to go into here, that in fact, China applied the theories of Karl Marx. Actually, I would argue, this may be somewhat controversial, but that China actually applied the Marxist economic model even more closely or more closely than, for example, the Soviet Union did. I haven't got time to go into that. There's a big theoretical chapters of this in the book. But anyone who reads what Marx actually wrote in the Communist Manifesto, or what Marx wrote in the Critique of the Gotha Program, will see that China's economic policy is the closest to that of Karl Marx. Therefore, this is a gigantic vindication of Marxism. So that's the second part of the really audience of the book. And the third one is because I believe that it's not necessarily only to project socialism in a narrow way, it's important to project it in a way that can organize wider forces, is you can actually understand China, not merely in terms of Marxism and socialism, you can understand it in terms of Western ideas and Western economic theories. It's not as precise, it takes much longer and so on and so forth, but it can be done. And even on this basis, you can understand the reasons for the success of China. The success of China is based on its state sector of the economy. China controls 40% of its investment through the state sector, and this is enough to control the development of the economy. Therefore, this is the real thing of the aim of this book, of contribution to this discussion in China. It's to get away from the nonsense which the West writes about human rights. I will say very bluntly that to take 853 million people out of poverty is the biggest contribution to human rights made by any country in the world. The improvement in the conditions of the Chinese people is the biggest of any country which is carried out in history, and this was achieved by socialism. This is, of course, what the West doesn't want the world to understand, because it will destroy all the myths and the attacks it makes on China and the disasters which have happened in countries like the United States over COVID and other things. So this is what really the aim of the book is. It's to make a contribution to explaining these three things. So it's part of an international discussion, and thank everybody who's here tonight for listening and participating in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. I would like to pass it now to Radhika Desai. Radhika, thank you so much for being with us.
Yes, thank you very much, Layan. And I'm very happy to be here. I received John's book a week or so ago, and I've been fascinated by it. Of course, I've known John for a long time and have learned a great deal from him, and my own engagement and understanding of China, as well as many other things, has benefited a great deal from my engagement with him. So let me just say about 7-8 things about, essentially, I'm going to unashamedly sell this book. My remarks are simply directed towards why you should buy this book, why you should read this book. So first of all, John Ross. John is uniquely qualified, I think, to deal with this subject that he proposes to deal with, namely communist China's growth record and its historical and theoretical significance. Because he speaks from a long engagement with China, going back to his university days, I remember him telling me, and very importantly, I would like to say also with the communist world in general, because John has also had a deep engagement with the Soviet Union when it existed. So he speaks with great authority on these matters. And of course, his engagement with China has been particularly deep in recent years because he has basically, I think over the last decade and a half, he has spent about half a year anyway in China. So that's represents a very important engagement, and worked at Chinese universities and at the Chongyang Institute. Therefore, he keeps a finger on the pulse of the Chinese public opinion. And he joins, and so therefore, when we read his book, we kind of join, as Western readers join Chinese netizens, as they're often called, in a shared understanding. As John himself said, he has a huge Weibo following. John has therefore also consistently engaged with China, Chinese issues, and so on from his blog, learningfromchina.net. John also has a very deep engagement, again, the engagement of an activist as well as a scholar, with Marx and the Marxist tradition more broadly, including, I would say, its development in China, both in Mao's time and today. So I think that's another important thing. At the same time, he's at ease with Western economics. And one of his favorite exercises is, look, I can show you this works from a Marxist angle, and I can also show you that it works from the perspective of Western economics, by which he, of course, picks out the critical traditions of Western economics, because the mainstream tradition is really quite bonkers anyway. So John wouldn't go anywhere near them. And further, he has, I feel, one of the most valuable things about John's writing and thinking is that it's political acuity. He always tends to know what is at stake, what is at issue, what is important at any given time. And finally, if you are particularly bad, if you are sort of not as good as generating statistics and graphs and charts as I am, you will particularly appreciate the way in which John visually presents information. He finds the original sources of data, and he reconstructs and visually presents information in a very useful way. And all of this is in this book. And I particularly compliment International Publishers and 1804 Books for producing color graphs and charts in a very accessible way in this otherwise extremely affordably priced book. So that was about John. And of course, having praised him to the skies like this, I wouldn't want you to think I'm a groupie, because I do have disagreements with John, and I will just register some of them, just so you know that I'm not simply interested in praising him to the skies. I actually don't think the US military is either a sign or a support of US power. I'm not as keen on using purchasing power statistics, purchasing power parity statistics as John is. I don't agree entirely with his criticism of the USSR, and I wouldn't use the word globalization the way he does. So these are just some of the differences. But despite these and many other differences, I always read what John says, and that is what I recommend you do. Why? Here are some of the reasons. These are, to me, the politically most important reasons. Number one, he argues that China is socialist. And he argues that China is socialist, and therefore he goes against the mainstream, which claims that China is just as capitalist. It's essentially a bad replica of capitalism. So China is capitalist, but it is authoritarian. And he goes directly against that. Further, it also goes against the Western left's very unfortunate concurrence with this mainstream diagnosis. And therefore, if you are on the left, and if you're curious, if you are at least beginning to feel that the Western left consensus on China might not quite be right, this is a very, very key book for you. And also, of course, he shows that China is socialist in a very excellent combination of a historical account backed by statistics and, of course, theory, as his short presentation just showed. Further, so another point is that for me it's very important is he recoups the Mao era. This is therefore he rejects this fashionable position that some people have of attributing China's recent success entirely to Dengist or market reforms or its turn to capitalism, etc. Even though at the same time he understands and he gives us a very good exposition of both Deng's politics and political economy as well as that of Xi Jinping. Further, he counters neoliberals in China by insisting that China is socialist and must remain so if it is going to continue. It is going to continue its success, because I often joke to my Western friends that, you think that in China there is censorship, but when I go to China and I encounter the debates there, I find that the spectrum of political opinion in China is way wider than anything we have in the West. And you can bet your last dollar that they have a lot of neoliberals in China and they need countering. And John puts his shoulder to that wheel. Further, he places China in the longer history of the world's development. To me, again, that's very important. I actually teach development studies, and I'm extremely allergic to this idea that you only talk about development in the developing countries. No, the story of the development of the West and that of today's developing countries is a single story. They have to be put in a single story in order to understand the historical significance of that development and the obstacles that today's third world countries have to overcome in order to develop. And John has already emphasized in his talk that China is an important lesson for the West. And I'd like to for the third world. And I would like to underline that, because the reason why China is important is that it has succeeded in developing the forces of production, in alleviating poverty, in executing the greatest industrial revolution in the history of humankind against the imperialist obstacles that the rest of the third world also encounter. So this is why China's experience is very important. Further, just three more points, I think. Three more points. He emphasizes that China learns. China, John loves to quote this expression, I think Mao's expression, seek truth from facts. But more importantly, I think he also demonstrates that China's leadership learns. China's leadership has a goal. It tries to do this, that, or the other to achieve that goal. And if something does not work, it quickly rejects it and looks for other ways of doing it. So China is very much a work in progress. And again, reading John's book helps us to understand how and why. And therefore, all of this permits us to place China in the longer history of humanity's struggle against capitalism and against imperialism. And finally, by focusing on the confrontation between the United States and China, which takes up a considerable part of the book, John demonstrates that socialism has a geopolitical economy. That is to say, it is not just about class struggle, but it is about class struggle plus international struggle between classes and between nations. You have to put the two of them in the same picture. That's what geopolitical economy does. And so that socialism will have a geopolitical economy, in that the path to socialism will run through international struggles and the building of nations and national economies, as much as it will run through the struggle of working people of all classes, peasants, workers, etc., against capitalist exploitation. And he shows finally, as I put it in the title of something I wrote recently, that today we are at a very important historical moment where the fate of capitalism itself hangs in the balance of international power, particularly the balance of power between China and the United States. So if you want to understand a great deal of what this moment in time is about, the conjuncture at which capitalism stands, the historic conjuncture at which capitalism stands and faces a choice between existence and non-existence, between life and death for capitalism. I think that if you want to understand this and want to contribute to the death of capitalism and the birth of socialism, I think you should read this book. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Radhika, for these glowing remarks and motivation to read. I echo, please everyone read this book. And next, I would like to welcome Vijay. Thanks, Vijay, for being here.
Oh, okay. Great to be here. I thought I was coming after Brian, but that's just fine. It's great to be here. John, congratulations on having your book published. It's good, really good, fantastic for us. Congratulations to 1804 for its first book. That's superb, and I hope many superb books come out of the press. I wanted to just pick up on what Radhika said, and then, John, I mean, I would be remiss if I just praised you, because thus far Wang Wen has praised you, then Radhika has praised you. So I need to launch a few attacks, if you don't mind. Otherwise, there's no credibility to this event. So I'm going to come in with a couple of my own pretend sharp barbs. Let's see if they land anywhere. First, I would like to say that it's been a pleasure to work with John in the No Cold War platform. We've been struggling to build some sort of political identity against this attempt by the United States to suffocate the world. And well, let's see where it goes. The book is important because the book comes in and makes a case against what I think is the rather facile approach and has been so for many decades in the West, particularly among left academics, of disparaging any experiment with socialism anywhere in the world, really. I mean, this starts in the disparagement of the Soviet Republic. Even before the USSR was created, they just disparaged things and said, well, it's not really socialism and so on. So I really commend John for coming in and saying, wait a minute, fellas, here's something for you to consider. Let's look at the actual record of the Chinese experiment. Let's see where it's gone. And John, I'm using the word experiment deliberately because I'm trying to get away from the idea that China has provided us with a model. Because I don't think there's the model approach is going to be beneficial. It's an experiment. I want to put on the table something that perhaps would help the Western academic, leftist academic, but also sections of the left, which is that we have to really take to heart the fact that all revolutions took place outside the main industrial core. There was no revolution in Germany or in France or in Great Britain or in the United States or in Canada. There wasn't. Revolutions took place in Tsarist Russia, which was barely developed. It was a peasant society. And there the genius of Lenin is really not to be undermined at all. I mean, he really saw and understood how the question of self-determination had to be at the center, the worker-peasant alliance had to be at the center, and so on. Immense lessons from the revolution against the Tsar were picked up in China. We got to really see what the Soviets pioneered, and John, the times that you criticized the Soviets for the first year plan, I had to underline each of those and write in the margins, no, wait, just wait. We've got to see things dialectically and in a spiral. Soviets attempted certain experiments. The Chinese were able to develop them in their own way. And also the Soviets provided political cover because the West was so focused in overthrowing the Soviet Union. It allowed China a lot of room to do all kinds of developments, particularly after the 1970s, when China was, in a sense, had the Soviet Union playing defense and the Chinese could experiment in their own way. So we got to tip our hats to the Soviets for the role they played, in clearing the field, in experimenting and pioneering in several different ways. I think that's important. Even when we look at the first 5-year plan period from 1929 onwards, I would approach it with a certain kind of formula. And the formula is this, that there is a ratio in any socialist experiment. There is a ratio between determinism or structure and voluntarism or agency. There is a ratio between determinism and voluntarism. And this ratio varies over different periods of time. So to compare something in the 1920s with something in the 1970s, without looking at the wider context in which this ratio operates, I think may not help us understand, new developments in the future in other countries where the ratios will be different, the context is different, the situation is different. So, I just feel like the first point I want to make here is that we got to go back and look at the Soviet experiment again with fresh eyes to understand at that time in the 1920s. And I think, John makes the point here, which is he quotes Lenin and says there are periods in history where politics has to override economics because they had to build up the industrial base. And without the building of that industrial base, let me tell you something, guys. Germany would be even more fascistic than it is today, infinitely more fascistic. I mean, for that, you got to thank the Soviet Union for crushing the fascists in Europe. So the building of that period has to be looked at, I think, with fresh eyes. So John, maybe it's time, volume 2, go back, turn to the experiments in the USSR, give a little more oxygen to the first 5-year plan, see it as something other than maybe an ultra-left deviation or an attempt to go too quickly to socialism, because partly people were also trying to experiment. Even in Marx's own writings, there are many, many contradictory suggestions. There's the critique of the Gotha program on one side, but there are also suggestions in theories on surplus value which seem to indicate in the other direction. Marx is not one particular, doesn't go in one particular direction. So the important thing I'd like to just point out here is this idea of the ratio between voluntarism and determinism. And when you look at the Chinese story, which John captures very well, in fact, in telling the Chinese story, he's attentive to the ratio between voluntarism and determinism. And that's the reason, John, why I think that your approach both to the Mao era and to then the Deng era is so scrupulously accurate. Because you look at the ratios in the two different kinds of geopolitical international periods and understand, given the levels of development in 1949, given the opportunities in the 1970s, that the policy orientation of the socialist state could be quite different. And I think that's one of the valuable theoretical things I got out of the book, is I was reading the book to try to understand the ratios. So that's the first thing. The second point I want to make, John, is that I feel like there's a conflation between the socialization of labor and the concrete experience of globalization from the 1990s onward. I totally 100% agree with the concept that the socialization of labor is absolutely essential for the advance to socialism. In fact, it's correct that in Capital Volume 1, Chapter 32, Marx makes a lot about the socialization of labor. It's correct as well that Adam Smith opens Wealth of Nations talking about the importance of the division of labor for the enhancement of productivity. That's correct theoretically. It's also correct in the long term. But the concrete policies of globalization from the 1990s were contrary to socialization of labor. In fact, they were the intense rigidification of the international division of labor with all the hierarchies attendant to it. This is where, David Ricardo didn't actually quite come to terms with colonialism. I mean, the fact is that Zambia continues to be an exporter of raw copper and an importer of everything else. Socialization of labor hasn't enabled many countries to go up the value chain. The Chinese, with deliberate political intent, moved away from the strictures of globalization to go towards upping the value chain, moving, say, to capital intensive from labor intensive. And they were able to do that because politics drove the agenda. It wasn't, just the law of the market and so on. So I feel like we should be somewhat more critical of the idea of globalization as we've seen it historically. Despite the fact, I think you're quite correct that in the long term, the socialization of labor is absolutely essential to develop productive forces, which is in itself a necessary point to drive the socialist experiment forward. So just to summarize the 2 points I was trying to make, one of them, I think it's important when people study the socialist experiments in the world, and particularly China, which has had by far the biggest breakthroughs of any of the socialist experiments we've seen in our time and before. When we study the socialist experiments, it's really important to look carefully at this ratio between voluntarism and determinism. It's very important, just so that we don't have too facile, quick a critique of the governments, because that's a too voluntarist understanding of the governments. or get stuck in saying that, it's at this stage of development or that stage of development. In other words, remain at the level of structure. And the second point I would say is, while it's quite correct that we look and anticipate the increasing socialization of labor in order to advance productive forces, advance productivity towards socialism, I think we have to be very careful about the globalization agenda and the way in which it continues to keep rigid old colonial hierarchies, and it's very difficult for countries to break out of them. So on that, thanks, congratulations for your book. It's been a pleasure to reread the articles, John, and I know I'm going to go back and dip into them again, learn more, argue more with them, and argue with you, of course, because there's no other way to advance socialism than to argue not only about our theories, but even argue the facts. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Vijay. And finally, I'd like to invite Brian Becker. Brian, thank you so much for joining. Brian, you're muted. Brian, can you unmute your microphone?
You think unmuting is important? I agree with you. John, congratulations on your book, China's Great Road, Lessons for Marxist Theory and Socialist Practices. I too feel the book is a real contribution. I want to encourage everyone to read it. I was taking notes for tonight's presentation, and I walked out to my car. I turned on the 105.5 FM, and the first words I heard were, and now we'll hear from John Ross, who has a new book called China's Great Road. And I thought, wait, this is getting very strange. John Ross is everywhere now. But it's so important, I think, that the writings of John Ross and his teachings become popular, because they need to be understood by the general public. First of all, it's the best antidote to the nonstop demonization by the so-called intellectuals and pundits who work in the service of the US government, which has now decided to make major power conflict or major power competition primary, the priority, number one priority for the US government. The general public needs it, and as others have said, the left needs it, because there has been this casting aside of China as if by the Maoists after the death of Mao and the arrest of the Mao faction or the Gang of Four. The Maoists said, that's it for China. China, just like the Soviet Union, is now social imperialist and there's nothing left to defend. And then later, different social democrats were mortified and horrified by the introduction of any market relations or the opening up so that foreign direct investment could take place. And they too cast off China. And I think it's a great disservice to the left. And I think what John has done is a great service because, one, it's based on data and facts. It's based on an actual investigation. And it shows clearly that China's spectacular rise and the way China's economy is organized, as he calls it, the macroeconomic management model, is completely different from that of the United States or the other Western capitalist economies. The role of the state in directing investment in particular shows that the Chinese state under the leadership of a communist party has tools and capacity and vision to develop, not simply to develop the productive forces per se, but to develop the productive forces according to a plan. And that plan has been modified, it's been amended. As the other colleagues here have said, it's also a lot of experimentation and innovation and learning lessons. So this is an important book. This is, I consider to be an extremely important book. And I talked to John last week, and we both agree that the issue of China, US-China relations, and the forward trajectory of China will be in many ways the defining issue for global politics in the coming period, and perhaps for a very long time. Now, the title of John's book is China's Great Road, Lessons for Marxist Theory and Socialist Practices. I think it's an ambitious title, and like the other colleagues, I want to, because we're in an exchange among comrades, be able to not simply highlight that which I think is a tremendous contribution from the book, and I really, really do. I value this book greatly, and I consider it a necessary resource. But there are some political conclusions that I would differ with John with, and I want to mention them. I don't want to go over the same territory that the other speakers. John's book, as I mentioned, helps us understand how the macroeconomic management model in place in China differs qualitatively from the United States and the other capitalist countries. John focused on, when he's talking about Marxist theory, on the economic policies of the Chinese government and their implications for Marxist theory. And he, as others have mentioned, advocates that this model, because it conforms to Marxist theory, thus functions and should function as a model for others. And I believe that for a full understanding of the period of dynamic and spectacular economic growth in the last 4 decades, we should in fact pay close attention to the political conjuncture that produced it. After all, it wasn't only China's decision to open up. The Western capitalist countries that had been the principal enemies of China between 1949 and 1972 changed course. It was they who decided to accept the invitation and begin massive investments in China. Understanding this, I believe, specific conjuncture was central and is central, and also suggests that it will not be reproducible for all of the other socialist countries, even though there are, as John mentioned, instances where imperialist countries by political decision have also permitted their corporations and financial institutions to engage in foreign direct investment. But there too, I believe these were for political motives principally. The Chinese Communist Party decided to open the country for foreign direct investment. And as we have talked about, this greatly stimulated production and development throughout the country. Because the foreign direct investment by imperialist corporations did not turn China into their neo-colony, this was able to be used by China for its own development. The Chinese state, under the leadership of the party, truly successfully managed and directed the process. In 1921, Lenin and the Bolsheviks offered foreign capitalist corporations a similar deal during the beginning of the new economic period, NEP, but there were very few takers, even though Lenin and the Bolsheviks and the Russian socialist government offered major concessions to these foreign corporations. So we have to go to the question, why did the US and the other imperialist governments allow massive foreign direct investment in China and the integration of China into the world economy? This was not only, even though it was partly about profits and economics, it was, I think, principally a political calculation. It was a political calculation that was central to their decision. The Western decision to invest heavily in China was not just premised on the possibility of profits, but it was part and parcel, if we're, I believe, being honest, of bringing China more securely into an anti-Soviet alliance, which was central to US strategy at that time. It was also a strategy that was directed not only against the Soviet Union, but all of the socialist camp, including Cuba. If you look at Fidel's talks in 1980, when he's complaining that foreign forces, including the US, he also identifies China, were trying to have the non-aligned summit that was scheduled to take place in Havana in the summer of 1980 be moved somewhere else. A bitter complaint on the part of Fidel about China's role. China, after having been unfairly isolated, from my point of view, from the USSR and the socialist camp because it had political differences with the Soviet leadership, China's foreign policy orientation changed in the 1970s, following that period of the Sino-Soviet division in the 1960s, was profound. And the US imperialist government welcomed this change in China's foreign policy as a political means of weakening the socialist camp as a whole. China's foreign policy turned in the late 1970s, in particular, aligning with imperialism and reactionary forces, provided a political foundation for its subsequent global economic integration into the world economy, including into the World Trade Organization. This in turn widened the range of economic policy possibilities for the Chinese leadership to a far greater degree than was ever afforded to the Soviet leadership in its formative phase of socialist construction, or to many other socialist governments today whose range of action is constrained by the constant threat of imperialist counter-revolution, not to mention sanctions and blockade. While we salute China for its remarkable success and its remarkable advances which help not only the people of China, and as John has pointed out, so, with such scholarship, help them in ways that are sort of unsurpassed in the history of the human race. China's remarkable advances have helped the people of the world, especially the developing world. But I question the idea of the general universality of the Chinese model, given that I believe it was derived less from a particular reading of Karl Marx or Marxist theory, and more from China's unique political history and its positioning within the Cold War at a particular moment in time, political conditions which are not easily reproduced. Nor do I think all the trade-offs that the Chinese leadership agreed to could or should necessarily be recommended to all other socialist countries. To use popular language rather than the older language of dialectics, one might say history is full of ironies, and the contradictions here couldn't be more plain. The US government now realizes that instead of turning China into a neo-colony or a constant vessel for super profits, China has taken advantage of its integration into the world economy. The Communist Party of China has successfully managed the process such that China has become stronger, its economy has become stronger, and because it has developed an economic model on a non-imperialist basis, it provides a real, credible, and used alternative to US hegemony and US domination. I don't have time to go over the various statements of US government officials, but Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor under Trump, says that the admission by the United States of China into the world economy, into the World Trade Organization was, as he calls it, the greatest failure of US foreign policy since the 1930s. Instead of listening to the CCP leaders and reading its key documents, O'Brien says, we believed what we wanted to believe, that the Chinese ruling party is communist in name only. They know now, meaning the US government, and this is why I believe there is a consensus, especially under the Xi Jinping leadership, that their idea that China would implode or that China would be turned into a neo-colony is nothing more than a fantasy. And as a consequence, they have decided that China must be the target in an existential way. In a way, China has become the new Soviet Union and considered an existential reality. And that accounts for the complete, sudden, rapid, and almost without any informed debate, reorientation of US policy towards China. We have to be able to defend China because it's being targeted unfairly by imperialism. It's being demonized. It's being slandered. The issues of Xinjiang or Tibet or Hong Kong or Taiwan or any other issue by the imperialists attempt to give their cause of trying to overthrow or stop or contain China a noble cause. It's not a noble cause. It's the same cause pursued by Queen Victoria and the British in the 1830s. It's the same orientation and premised on the same needs of the colonial powers for the past hundreds of years. So we have to defend China. And for socialists, they have to learn about what China is doing, the innovations, the experiments, and why it's succeeding so well. We have to win over the American people and influence the socialist left so that they remove themselves from these retrograde positions on China. having the American people read John Ross's book, having the socialist movement read John Ross's book, China's Great Road, I believe is an important counterweight to the lies that are being spoon-fed to the people by politicians and the corporate-owned media, and to the confusion that reigns supreme among some sectors of the US left. So John Ross, again, congratulations on the book. We are certainly using it here in Washington, DC. As you know, we've had you on our broadcast, at our meetings. We will, of course, be able to study this book going forward. Thank you so much for writing it.
Thank you so much, Brian. And thank you, Vijay, Radhika, and Wang Wen, who's unfortunately not with us right now, and John, for your comments. In the true spirit of discussion and debate, I think this was a great motivation to pick up the book, read the book, formulate your own arguments, engage with the articles, and engage in struggle for a better world today. And I want to take the last 5 minutes that we have to pass it back to John for some closing remarks in response to what we have just heard.
Well, I've had so many kind words, I'm not going to respond to them. I'll only go on to deal with the criticisms. But this is crucial. This is the beginning of an enormous discussion. I am absolutely convinced that the discussion of the world socialist movement in the coming years, in the same way as after 1917, every socialist in the world had to define themselves in relationship to the Soviet Union, for or against, how much for, the against I'm not very interested in, but the discussion. I profoundly believe, because of the enormous facts which are taking place, that this is going to be the same in the discussion regarding China. So I just welcome this discussion. I'm very pleased for everybody to say exactly what they think, and we can deal with them. And again, to take one of the most important principles in China, I mean, Mao Zedong, is it's crucial to distinguish, as he put it, between contradictions between the people and the enemy, which have to be dealt with by struggle, and in the worst cases, even by wars and violence, not by our choice, but by their choice, and contradictions amongst the people, which have to be discussed out and which will lead to a better understanding. So I take all the points here made this evening to be contradictions among the people, which have therefore got to be discussed about in these things. Just very briefly, to deal with some of the points. The book does not deal, on Brian's point, doesn't deal with the history of China's foreign policy. That would be a separate subject. It does deal with Xi Jinping's present formulations on Chinese foreign policy. And I would say, as regards those present formulations on Chinese foreign policy, I very much agree with them. And I think they're actually very profound ideas. On the question of what Vijay said about the experience of the Soviet Union, I in addition to living in China and working in China, I lived for 8 years in Moscow. And I have some of my closest friends in my life are Russians. And they would all say that whatever was the economy of the 1929 Soviet model, it was necessary geopolitically in order to defend the country against foreign attack and against fascism. That's their profound view. That's a geopolitical argument. I'm not arguing against that. What I'm making a point is it was not what Marx said from the point of the economy, and that system could have been changed after World War II. What I do think was a profound error is after the defeat of fascism, that there was not a movement towards the type of economic reform which was seen in China. And there were two major mistakes made. One was not to open up for the Soviet economy not to participate in world trade, and to continue. This is again another question which can be discussed with the collectivization of agriculture. So I want to distinguish the geopolitical questions from the economic ones. Finally, why does this affect me so much? Of the people who I most admire in the post-World War II, there are undoubtedly the achievements of the Chinese Communist Party and of Fidel Castro, of the Cuban leadership. That's my political frame of reference. And therefore, I would take very seriously what Fidel Castro said, that China is the best hope, as he puts it, of the third world. And I remember very vividly the only person who we may say of real historical stature I've ever had the honor to meet was Hugo Chavez, when I was invited there to have several discussions. And I know the terrible confusion that existed in the Latin American left. I was at a meeting, it was chaired, that particular session was being chaired by Maduro, who's now the president of Venezuela. And I was sitting next to a Brazilian socialist who said to me, he found out I was from Chinese university, he said to me, please don't say that China's socialist. You can say it's very good, anything like that, but just don't say it's socialist. So I start off my report by saying I'm going to make a report on the success of socialist China. And that is what I do believe, and this is the great step forward which I take place, and I do very much relate it to the situation in Brazil, but also in other countries in Latin America. At that time, people did not pay attention. We go back to the period to 2000 to say 2014. People were not discussing the lessons of China when it was the most successful economy in the world, and this was a huge mistake. Now they are, the left is discussing this. I would have some differences. I would have a more strict Marxist interpretation. The more I read Marx, the more I become convinced that he was right. And I do seriously believe that the Chinese economic model is the best, the closest implementation of what Marx is wrote. In that sense, might say than some of what Vijay said. I'm a bit more strict Marxist in my interpretation. But this is a discussion that we want to do. So what I would like the book to do is to give firstly to give the facts to the left, to do two things: to refute the attacks that are made on China, and secondly, to give the facts on which to make a basis of the study of China. Then I've got my theoretical interpretations of it, which are in the book. So thank you everybody very much for recommending the book to be read. I welcome this as the beginning of a discussion that will take place on a most extraordinarily important question for people throughout the entire world and for every socialist in the world. So thank you very, very much, both for the kind words and thank you in a different way for the criticism.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. And I hope that we can continue the discussion. I encourage everyone to continue the discussion in your context and your organizations and your communities. And thank you all for being here, for your contributions to this discussion today. I want to say thank you to everyone who participated. And we hope to hear your comments and your insights as you all read the book and think it through. And I want to thank you all for the time you've spent. Have a wonderful evening, and hopefully we will continue this very soon. Please stay in touch with us at the People's Forum and at 1804 Books, and see you all again.